Alright, this time we're going to do something a little different format-wise, but what I wanted to do was go into something that I didn't get a chance to cover in the previous video because I got a little carried away talking about different methods for collecting reference images in Monster Hunter World, which Monster Hunter cosplayers might find handy, but as a general bit of advice, might not be as useful to other people. Although some of the same techniques can be used to, of course, grab screenshots from other games and then use them to properly reference and scale everything. But scale is actually what we are here to talk about. Using a screenshot like this doesn't necessarily inform you of the size that everything kind of needs to be. You can sort of eyeball it and understand that this needs to, you know, reach from about the bottom of your knee to about halfway down your foot, but when you're working in more precise measurements, if you want things to look as nice as possible, you do kind of need to have a more numerical sense of what the scale is, so you can measure it out with, you know, paper and ruler and everything. So I'm going to teach you a really nice, simple method for calculating scale. What you first need to do is establish how big your your base model is. More specifically, you need to understand how big everything is in relation to kind of like one static reference point. Easiest way to do this, especially with human video game characters, is to use height. So in this case, let's say our hunter, from about the tip of his head down to the bottom of his heel, tip of his toes, you want to go by the heel if you can. Select all that. About 1,522 pixels tall. This is one of the reasons why I like using Krita. It's free and it gives you stuff like this. So you know how big your selection is. So from here, it's actually somewhat easy to calculate scale. So you get out a little notepad here, get out a little calculator, and I'm going to say our hunter, let's say he is 6 feet tall, which is 72 inches. And then that equals, round this down a little bit because actually top of the helmet there isn't exactly the top of his head, it's a little bit taller, but we'll say he's 1520 pixels tall. What you do from there, divide 72 by 1520, and that gives you your total that, well, I've got this a little bit backwards, but we can do 1 pixel equals 0.047 inches. And some change, but once you get past that third or fourth place there, it's just not worth recording because, well, inches don't necessarily go down that far. So, now that we've got this, we can actually use this to calculate the scale on all kinds of things. Do you want to know how big this bag is? Well, if our hunter is in fact, here, get that a little bit closer. If our hunter is in fact 6 feet tall, we just take our little measurement here, and we've got a height of 124 pixels. Here, we'll bring that down a bit, and that equals, just take our total, 124 multiplied by 0.047. That bag is 5.828 inches tall. And then you can keep going from there and measure this segment, measure how wide this little buckle is, how wide the strap is, how wide the little piping on the corners is, and so on until you know more or less precisely how big that thing is. In my case, I wanted to get a little measurement on the Scoutfly lantern specifically. And here we go. So from the very top of this cap down to the very bottom of the cage there, pull up our paper. We've got, we'll round that out to 210 pixels. The height of the selection, 210 pixels. So simple enough. 210 multiplied by our little standard of 047 gives us 9.87 inches tall. Nice and straightforward. Now, right away, this is fairly, like, this is kind of as easy as it comes. There's not a lot of work there. It's just a matter of getting the proper measurements and going about kind of measuring all the little things that need to be more precise. If you are doing, say, CAD design work, or if you're mocking this up for 3D printing, this can be really handy for establishing these measurements right away. Although one thing that does help, because even staring at this in relation to this hunter and everything else in this room, even just looking at the numbers, it's very easy to just sort of let this not fully register in your head for how large this is. So what I would suggest doing is getting out a pencil, piece of paper, and a ruler, and taking the time to like do a rough sketch out. Like if you know this thing is, get a little closer to that edge. So we know this thing is about 97 pixels wide. Yet again, get out our paper and there. So 97 pixels equals 047. It's about 4.5 inches wide, give or take. So 4.5 inches. Now, when you are looking at these two measurements, about 10 inches by 4.5 wide, that may not register in your head as a specific size, and that can make it a little bit confusing. Now, when you lay that out on paper, it may actually end up being a little bit larger than you intended. And that may mean that your scale needs to be adjusted. Because, yeah, 9.5, or, well, nearly 10 inches, it's about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. And maybe a little bit bigger. And 4.5 inches is fairly wide when you also consider that this thing is going to be jutting out from your belt underneath. Here, just as an example, you've got the belt, the clothes underneath, more belts, some extra dinosaur skin there. You've got all this other material there, and then on top of that, so you're going to have a couple inches of padded material hanging around your waist. You're going to have about another 4 inches of material jutting straight out from your body. Seems a little excessive. So it may seem fine until you kind of put it into the full context. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here with maybe you need to adjust your scale. Because maybe you aren't 6 feet tall. Maybe you're taller. But, you know, that's still a fairly large size for a lantern. You also have to consider everything else that you're going to have to deal with. But I'm getting a little bit off topic here. This is more cosplay preparedness than calculating scale. So what you might want to do instead of assuming the size, because right off the bat, Monster Hunters they're kind of larger than life to begin with. Like the hunter characters haul around these massive weapons and fight dinosaurs. So everything's already kind of unrealistically proportioned when you consider how big some of these items are. And other thing to consider is just the amount of materials that's going to go into this. Having a foot long, half a foot wide lantern thing hanging off your belt may be heavier than you expect. So there's also that sort of thing to consider. And likewise, if you calculate it exactly to scale, it might come out looking more cartoonish rather than being kind of like contextualized in sort of the scale of the full suit of cosplay armor that you're going to be wearing. So one of the things you can do instead to calculate this a little bit closer to your own proportions is to do this kind of backwards. So I'm gonna stop scrolling in and out, that's a little disorienting. But what you can do instead is decide, alright, I want this thing to be 3.5 inches wide. So I'm going to open up my paper, and I'm just going to do the same math backwards. We're going to have a width of, 97 pixels. So 97 pixels equals 3.5 inches. Do the inches, 3.5, divided by 97. That gives us a new scale of 1 pixel equals 0.036 inches. So, taking that same thing, we can now do, instead of this thing being 9 inches tall, we'll do 210 times 0.036. Now it's 7.5 inches tall. Or long, however you prefer to consider it. A little bit more manageable. What you can also do that'll help is take the time to kind of scratch out all of these measurements and on a large sheet of paper, even using scrap paper, piece of cardboard, whatever, make a rough mock-up. So just make like a little rounded cylinder and kind of lay these parts out and, you know, have that against your hip and kind of look in a mirror, see how that looks, see how that shapes up, and then work from there. And get a sense for like, okay, this thing needs to be larger, this thing needs to be smaller, this cage is going to be too big, whatever. It helps to kind of take the time to do this math instead of just doing it once, committing to that scale, and then ending up with a lot of very large, clunky sort of pieces. In cosplay and prop making, it does sometimes pay off to make something just a little bit larger than it actually needs to be. For like cartoony space guns and laser swords and stuff, it sometimes helps to make it just a little, like a percentage or two larger, just so it pops a little bit more on camera and it's more, has more visual impact and weight to it. In other cases, it doesn't hurt to sort of scale things down. Yeah, it's a little bit of balancing accuracy, scale, practicality, and visual impact all together. So these are things to consider. Since I have this screen cap, I can also do this in a different way. Just to quickly change gears here before I wrap up this video, because this video is also running long. Now that I know how large I want this thing to be, say I've taken the time, I've done my little rough mock-ups, I decide I want this thing to be about 10 inches long. No taller, no shorter, no wider, etc. So now we've got this. It is a little crooked, which makes calculating straight up and down values, so I'm just going to twist that a bit. So now we got that straight up and down. It's also a little bit of an angle. I don't know if I would recommend doing this. Nonetheless, you can now see, okay, I need this thing to be, yet again, 10 inches. So yeah, this is going to be a little inaccurate because we can't see the cap in this, but same as before. Take out our notepad, take out our calculator. We've got 1476 pixels equals 10 inches. With that, we take 10 divided by 1476, gives us 1 pixel equals 0.006 inches. Pretty small, but we're working with a very large image here. So now that we know that, we can go in here. We've got our scale. So width of 74 pixels. Again, open our stuff. 74 pixels equals, so 74 times 0.006. That is about half an inch, give or take, so 0.444 inches. And then I can just continue to do that. Of course, it helps to have more straightforward up and down sort of reference, but I think you get the idea. There are other things that I could recommend and probably go on for a while. It helps to get as many measurements as possible, and if you can, plan this out on paper, make a rough sketch of what you're doing, and just tick off all the marks and say, you know, here, let me just grab a brush of some kind and be like, okay, from here to here, it's so many inches. The gap between these things, so many inches. Size of this part versus this part, doing this with the mouse sucks. So many inches, so many inches. And just keep doing that until you have a sort of proportioned out drawing that tells you how far apart certain pieces should be, how much certain parts intersect, and so on. And then once you have all of that, it'll help you to kind of plan things out. You can almost do it step by step, so you can understand that, okay, from here to here is so many inches, and then the curve starts at about this many inches down, and then extends so far down, which means I need a circle that curves that much, and so on. And this piece intersects with the curve, so there's a little bit of a curve in there where that ring applies, and you can keep going from there. And I'm just kind of babbling at this point, but it gives you a good sense for where everything should be. And when parts aren't where they should be, you know when you've made a mistake, as opposed to just sort of assuming where all these measurements would be and having to go back after the fact to figure them out. Taking the time to do all of this ahead of time makes a big difference. And yet again, having multiple pieces of reference, multiple photos, which I have a whole folder of photos, you can just look at this from all the different angles and yet again use kind of your established measurements to measure in pixels and so on to figure out your scale and calculate backwards to get measurements for things that may not be visible from certain other screenshots. But I think with all of that, we have it about covered, at least for calculating scale. It's very basic math. So with these Scoutfly lanterns, I hope to start working on these soon. My schedule is going to be getting a lot busier with some other stuff coming up, so I'll try and stick to the plan of doing one video a week, and we'll see how that goes. I intend to make both of the Scoutfly lanterns, especially these little pendant ones. They're a little bit easier, and you can even see when you look up close, they've got some extra little details that aren't normally apparent when you're looking at them from far away. Little scratches and little kind of intersecting angles. So yeah, with the next video I'm going to go into designing and laying out how all these things kind of look, and having all these different angles on the reference will give me a sense for how big the arcs need to be and how many parts I need to make and so on. But thank you for watching. Hopefully this was remotely entertaining and useful, and with any luck you'll join me for the next video when we actually start making some stuff. So till then, take care.